I'm Dan Wilkers. I'm the pastor at the Parkway Presbyterian Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Also a part of a group called Pilgrims of Ebeline, which is a peacemaking project in Israel-Palestine. I was at a workshop for ministers in Christian education. The guy who was leading it was a guy named Don Griggs. He was at the time the executive director of Pilgrims of Ebeline, and he invited several of us to come back that evening to see ostensibly it was a travelogue of Israel. He showed us incredible pictures and, more importantly, talked about what was going on there. And I really was a babe in the woods at that point. I had no idea. He encouraged me to read a couple of books by a guy named Abuna Elias Shakur. One was called We Belong to the Land, and the other was called Blood Brothers. And that was the first time I heard about the Nakba. Abuna Shakur talks about his family being evacuated from his home village of Biram up in the Galilee, 20 miles from the Lebanon border. I had no idea that had taken place. So I began to read more and more, study a little bit, and then found a guy named Bob Sawyer, who was a Moravian pastor in Winston-Salem, who became the executive director after Don Griggs quit it, and went to Israel-Palestine for 2 weeks with Bob and another group, and we stayed in Bethlehem for a week, and then went up to the Galilee for a week to Ebeline. And that was the eye-opening trip for me. I mean, I had no idea what was going on over there because we're not told in the United States. We don't hear the full story. We need that kind of firsthand exposure, I think, to see. I don't know where it came from, but we Americans shrug our shoulders and say, well, this has been going on since Abraham, since Esau and Isaac, and that's not true. It has been going on since 1948. I keep telling people whenever I get to make a presentation, this crisis has been going on as long as I've been alive. Not a minute more, not a minute less. Since I was born in 1948, I can talk like that. I spent 2 weeks in Israel-Palestine, spent a week on the West Bank living in Bethlehem with this group, and then a week in Galilee. During our time in Bethlehem, we had occasion to go into Jerusalem to see the holy sites. You know, you got to do that when you got Christians along. You got to go see these things. And it was interesting because our guide was a Palestinian. He met us at the airport when we landed in Tel Aviv and rode with us on our bus as far as the barrier into the West Bank. He could not cross with us. Said he would meet us the next day when we came back through the barrier. In other words, his travel was restricted, and I found that a little bit off-putting. In my time in Bethlehem, we stayed at a guest house associated with Christmas Lutheran Church, and Mitri Raheb is the pastor there. And there were a lot of young people around the campus there, and it was great to talk to them, but heartbreaking at the same time. One little girl was showing us around, one young woman was showing us around the campus and the library, which was pitifully small. And she said, with a smile on her face, by the way, I'm a terrorist. And we went, excuse me? She said, I'm on a list. I said, how did you get on the list? She said, well, I took part in a peaceful demonstration, and the IDF soldiers that were monitoring that demonstration took all our names, and so we're all on lists now. She said, you'd be hard-pressed to meet anybody here that wasn't a terrorist, according to the Israeli government. Well, that put me at ease. I talked to another young woman who was from Nazareth. It's 60, 70 miles away. And I said, it must be nice for you to go to school so close to home. She said, well, I haven't seen my parents in a year and a half. I said, that's odd. Why? Well, I can't travel to Nazareth unless I have a travel permit. I said, what if your father was critically ill, had a heart attack? She said, unless the Israeli government gave me a travel permit, I'd be turned back at the first checkpoint once I left Bethlehem. Wow. The restriction on individual rights and freedoms in the occupied territory is amazing and heartbreaking. While we were in Galilee, we went up to a town called Biram. It is now a national Israeli park, if you will. It was the village that Elias Shakur's family was driven from. A guy named Tommy, T-A-M-I, Tommy, met us to take us through. So we walked into what was essentially a bombed-out ruins. Several of the buildings had been kind of reconstructed. One was an old convent, which according to the sign was an old synagogue. But there was no synagogue in Bahram, according to Tommy and according to Abuna Shakur. So we toured the town and heard the story. There's a small Melkite Catholic church there, and people come once a year to celebrate their anniversary, the anniversary of the founding of that church. But other than that, they stay away, except for the cemetery. Outside of town, there's a cemetery. It's a cemetery for the families of Bahram. And so the only way these folks can go home again is when they die. That story reminded me of what I had read in Abuna's books about We Belong to the Land. And we asked Tommy about it. Not that we didn't trust what Abuna said, but we wanted to get some verification. Had you been around during that forced evacuation during the Nakba period? He said, yes, I was a little boy. First they came in, the IDF came in, Israeli forces came in. Wasn't called the IDF back then. This was in 49, 50, 40, 48 or 49, sorry. And took all the men and took them in trucks away from their families and told the women and children they had to leave the village. So the women and children walked to a village nearby, and there were folks there took them in. But the men were gone. Shakur's father walked back and found his family and then went to make intercession with the Israelis about getting back, because they had had some agreement with the Israeli commander that after a period of time they would be able to go back and reoccupy the town and their olive grove, which they had tended for centuries. Finally, the Israeli commander acceded to their request and told them they could wait on the hill overlooking Bahram. And they watched their village being bombed and destroyed. And so what we see now in Bahram is the ruins, not just of a village, but of a whole lifestyle. Families were ruined. And now, like I said, the only way people from Bahram can go home is to go home to be buried. And that's just sad. That's heart-wrenching sad. That's not, oh, I feel bad about it sad. That's in your gut, heart-wrenching sad. That's just one story of the thousands of Palestinian stories that you can hear like that, of villages that were forcibly evacuated. You know, most of the Palestinians I talked to suggested that they wanted a one-state solution. That is, they wanted a secular nation of Israel where they would be seen as full citizens. And the curious thing from what I've read and understand in talking with people is that the folks that are in charge in the Israeli government are not necessarily religious Jews, but more secular Jews. But let me tell you the story of a guy I met. He runs the WIAM Center for Palestinian Conflict Resolution. His name is Zugbi. Honestly, that's his name. He's a wonderful guy, and you walk into the center, and there's a portrait of Mahatma Gandhi on one side, a portrait of Dr. King on the other side, and you think, this is going to be interesting. You sit down with Zugbi, and he says, first of all, you need to know I'm a terrorist. And everybody at the table kind of went, what? Oh, yeah, I'm on any number of lists. I've been in prison 7 times. What'd you do to get in prison 7 times? I mean, you know, what was it, speeding tickets? What? That he was part of peaceful demonstrations, things like that, and just got rounded up, you know, and put in jail. How long did you stay in jail? Well, there's really nobody was notified that I was in jail, so my family didn't know to go to whatever magistrate there was to plead my case or to pay bail or whatever. And so I stayed there for a matter of months, several times. But was it okay? I mean, they fed you 3 hots and a cot kind of deal. And he said, well, they beat us to get information. But other than that, it was all right. And he's running a center for conflict resolution now. So Zugbi is an example. He decides that the way to work in this system is to work to teach conflict resolution skills to Palestinians so they won't have the kind of igniting kind of matchstick interactions with Israeli Defense Forces that they might ordinarily have, and to talk more rationally, work things out. It's nice. I wish they had that in Tel Aviv. I became aware of the whole situation by reading Abuna Shakur's books, Blood Brothers and We Belong to the Land. I had no idea about the Nakba. I had no idea. I understood that Israel's founding in 1947 by the UN was a response to the Holocaust, and I thought a genuine humanitarian response to the Holocaust, and a good response. Thank God for that. And I want the nation of Israel to be a strong people. I want them to be strong allies of the United States, but I also want the Palestinians to be a strong allied people to the United States too. So when I read about that, I did more reading and talked to more people, and ultimately then got a chance to go over a couple of years ago for 2 weeks and talk to people. You know, I like to talk to people, and I like to listen to what they have to say. We went to the Deheshe camp, and I asked a guy there, "How long have you lived here?" And he said, "Are you ready?" He said, "I've lived here since I was born." How old are you? 52 years old. He said, "But things have changed. We used to have permission to leave the camp. Now we can go out on our jobs and actually work a job." And I said, "Yeah, but you can't live anywhere else. I mean, you're living in this camp, which is really not cool. Not paved streets and houses really, really tightly, densely packed in. It's no place you'd want to live or I'd want to live." But that's the Deheshe camp, and that's where he lives for 50 years. 50 years. And he's still got hope. Golly. I mean, that's just amazing to me. Anyway, so I wanted to kind of see for myself if what I read in books was actually true, and it was, and I was appalled by the reality. The Kairos document that I mentioned before is one of those pieces of literature that speaks really vividly of the Christian concern for peace. And people of faith, of all faiths, at the heart of their faith is some sense of wanting peace, even an existential peace, some sense of peace with nature, some sense of peace with a higher power, and peace with one another. So people of faith need to be engaged in this, need to be involved in this. People of all faiths, because it affects people of all faiths. And I've talked to my congregation. On Christmas Eve, I work out of a character at our worship service. And one year, when I came back from Israel-Palestine, I took the character of a contemporary Palestinian father who lived in Bethlehem. Told my congregation I was going to do this. As I got up to preach, 4 people left. And when I talked to them later on, I said, "Why'd you leave?" "We didn't want to hear your story about Palestinians." Why? Because we live in America. We don't want to hear the Palestinian story. All we hear is the Israeli story.